Hey guys, so today I'm going to be watching Atun Shei's new Checkmate Lincolnites episode. I was in the office today and I saw that he released a new Checkmate Lincolnites and I got pretty excited. And instead of watching it immediately like I wanted to, I'm going to do a reaction video. So this is gonna be my first true reaction video of not seeing it beforehand. But here we go. I love his work, and I'm hoping we can keep his trend going. I might do it part one, part two. I don't know yet. If so, I'm going to push my In Defense of Washington video, which is planned for tomorrow, to probably Saturday. So that would be 2 days from Thursday. Here we go.
So, Billy Yank, my very good friend, wasn't it kinda about states' rights?
Yeah, Johnny Reb. States' rights.
Two old slaves! Whew. There it is. Checkmate, Lincolnites! Welcome back to the show. I missed you all so very much. Now, watch and be amazed, for tonight I will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the war between the states had nothing to do with slavery. It was about states' rights versus tyrannical overreach in federal government. Nah.
I feel like he's gone over this before, but it clearly was not. And he's definitely going to speak more about it. But as one professor told me, a state's right to do what? And it's obviously to own slaves. So I guess in that sense, he's technically correct.
Not really, man. Hold your horses now. John C. Calhoun himself said that if there be no protective power for the states, they must be forced to rebel. What about the Tariff of Abominations in 1828? States' rights was an issue way before slavery. What about the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion? And there were many other times when issue of states' rights or limitation on federal power in general popped up as stated. Also, I must ask, are you an anarcho-syndicalist?
I don't know what that is, so no. But to your point, yeah, I mean, states' rights was a huge issue in the early national and antebellum periods and remains one to this day, as was slavery, right from the very beginning. The two issues intertwined in really interesting and complex ways before finally coming to a head in the secession winter of 1861. It's a big topic, so would you mind if we went about this chronologically?
So yeah, states' rights has basically been the pillar of American democracy prior to the Revolutionary War. Basically, every individual colony had their own local autonomy, which was given to them by the British government. It was not one United States at that time. It was you identified based upon your state. You didn't identify based upon the country as a whole. So I would say I'm a North Carolinian, or someone would say they're a Georgian, or that they're a New Yorker. That's how you would identify prior to, frankly, the Civil War, when we saw a more unified central government.
Certainly. Where shall we begin?
7 years ago, baby.
The start of the country.
The first war of American independence. A pity you Northerners grew to become the self-same yoke we once fought so hard to throw off. Forced into secession by your many aggressions and usurpations, we reluctantly took up the mantle of American freedom to found a truly more perfect union as the Founding Fathers had intended. A confederacy of autonomous republics vis-a-vis the states, bound together for mutual advantage, but free to pursue our own destinies. And
So this idealistic thing that he's talking about was actually implemented after the Revolutionary War under the Articles of Confederation, and it literally didn't work. The Articles of Confederation basically gave the federal government virtually no powers at all. They couldn't enact taxes. They couldn't have a standing army. They frankly could do nothing. And what would happen is these individual colonies would have to, or I guess technically states now, would have to do all the functions of government while trying to keep this weird union. There's a weird rule in the Articles of Confederation that it had to be all 13 colonies had to agree on certain votes.
And, stuff.
Well, we tried that at first with the Articles of Confederation, but that worked
Sorry.
about as well as a screen door in a submarine.
Well, you would think that, wouldn't you? Because it was you,
I didn't know he was going to talk about that immediately.
government-worshipping Northerners who bamboozled us liberty-loving Southerners into ratifying the Constitution and accepting a much more powerful federal government than we had originally bargained for.
Actually, most educated people in the Deep South were all for the Constitution and eagerly sought the stability it provided. The Revolutionary War had been incredibly hard on the Carolinas and Georgia. The fighting there...
So the Carolinas and Georgia, what many people don't realize is that it was basically the first civil war, the Revolutionary War in those areas, because you had so many Tories, which were colonists who were loyal to the British government. So what would happen is whole towns would be fighting against each other because half was Tory, half was pro-revolution. It wasn't like New England, who was very, very pro-revolution. In the South, it was kind of more ambiguous because they really didn't get affected by the taxes that a port city such as Boston would, just because of how rural the South was. And especially when you get to Western North Carolina, many of them did not really see a reason for succession from the British Empire.
Was highly unconventional and brutally partisan, and it absolutely devastated the entire region. And we got to remember, at the time, these were still sparsely populated backcountry colonies. The halcyon days of King Cotton were still far in the future. In 1788, the South Carolina House of Representatives met to consider ratification of the new Constitution. Arguing for the document's merits, Federalist delegate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney did not mince words.
The southern states are weak. We are so weak that by ourselves we could not form a union strong enough for the purpose of effectually protecting each other. Without union with the other states, South Carolina must soon fall. Is there anyone among us so much a Quixote as to suppose that this state could long maintain her independence if she stood alone, or was only connected with the southern states? I scarcely believe there is.
You mentioned Shei's Rebellion, which is a perfect example of what Pinckney was talking about here. In 1786, a year before the Constitutional Convention, Massachusetts raised taxes to insanely high levels.
What a shocker.
Under the Articles of Confederation, the state government was basically unaccountable, and these taxes disproportionately affected the very poor. When they inevitably couldn't pay,
So see, here you go. The Articles of Confederation does not allow for a federal standing military. So therefore, the Massachusetts state militia is going to be responsible for taking down Shei's Rebellion. Now, imagine this is Massachusetts, who was basically one of the most prosperous, wealthy colonies at the time. Imagine this in Georgia. Imagine this in South or North Carolina, where it would be much harder to take control of rebel groups. It would be very, very difficult to combat something like Shei's Rebellion. And you kind of see this immediately after Shei's Rebellion with the Whiskey Rebellion, where George Washington was able to easily quell the rebellion, just because he had a federal army which he was able to lead. Well, during Shei's Rebellion, it was much more difficult to get rid of, just because there was no way to form a federal military, and it was up to the states to solve that issue.
the state seized their homes. So, led by a veteran named Daniel Shays, they picked up their guns and went down to their county seat to physically prevent the courts from issuing further foreclosure orders.
Sounds like a bunch of troublemaking freeloaders looking for a handout.
They were white.
Brave rebels. The tree of liberty must be watered by the blood of patriots.
That's a Thomas Jefferson quote, and it's one of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes.
Soon, protest erupted into open revolt. The Confederation government was basically toothless, so it was up to Massachusetts to put the rebellion down. It took the state months to organize a response, and there wasn't enough public money to raise a militia, so they had to rely on, get this, private donations from the wealthy, who certainly didn't want to.
That's actually a policy that I've heard libertarians suggest in the libertarian presidential debates. This is way off topic, but they actually want the United States military to be funded by donations. That seems very, very strange to me. and very, very ineffective. There's no freaking way that the individual Americans can pay for a whole army. Just shows a great example of how ineffective that policy would be.
Guns running around. Once they did raise troops, the rebellion was quashed pretty quickly, but all things considered, the government's handling of the crisis had been an utter disaster. Again, Charles Pinckney put it well.
Ask the people of Massachusetts if the Confederation protected them during the insurrection of Shays.
His words take on a whole new meaning when you consider that South Carolina's greatest threat of rebellion came from within many South Carolinians' own homes. Their own oppressed underclass had a much longer and more turgid list of grievances than any Shays regulators could write. And if a relatively small rural rebellion could bring a prosperous and populous state like Massachusetts to its knees under this system, then what possible chance would the states of the Deep South have in the event of their worst nightmare?
That is an excellent point. That I did not even think about that. Just think about what some local farmers and veterans did to Massachusetts. Imagine if in South Carolina, for instance, who at one point in time had more slaves than actual citizens in South Carolina, would rise up in this ineffective government known as the Articles of Confederation. You would basically have what would be Haitian revolutions across the Deep South. That is an awesome point. I did not even think about that.
Nightmare. A full-scale slave revolt.
All right. So perhaps the Confederation government was to be improved upon. But you can't deny that we Southerners ratified the Constitution only warily. We embraced it out of necessity, but opposed it ideologically. Now,
I would disagree with that, because you can look at people who supported the federal government, such as George Washington, who was a Virginian, who literally led basically the conference to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. There were many people in the South who did not agree with the Articles of Confederation, and it was kind of a mixed bag. I think that's way too simplistic of a take, and I'm sure he's going to debunk that immediately as well.
Now quote Representative Rawlins Lowndes, a most honorable gentleman, responding to Charles Pinckney in that same debate.
The Treaty of Peace with Britain expressly agreed to acknowledge us as free, sovereign, and independent states, which privileges we lived at the present in exercise of. But this new Constitution at once swept those privileges away, being sovereign over all, so that this state will dwindle into a mere skeleton of what it was.
Well, you're not going to like this, but the reason that Lowndes was so concerned about South Carolina's waning self-sovereignty was because of that part in the Constitution that allowed Congress to ban the importation of slaves starting 20 years from then, in 1808. In his rebuttal to Lowndes, Pinckney explained that they had had to fight tooth and nail to keep the importation of slaves going at all, and urged slave owners to consider other important constitutional guarantees for slavery that they had been able to secure.
By this settlement, we have secured an unlimited importation of Negroes for 20 years, nor is it declared that the importation shall be then stopped. It may be continued. We have a security that the general government can never emancipate them, for no such authority is granted.
Unfortunately for the slaves, though, when Thomas Jefferson's administration banned the importation of slaves, this made it so that women slaves were very valuable, because they could be essentially used to create more slaves, because that was the only legal way of bringing in new slaves into the South. So, though on the surface this does sound good, it also started this disgusting trade that would last until emancipation.
We have obtained a right to recover our slaves in whatever part of America they may take refuge, which is a right we had not before. In short, considering all circumstances, we have made the best terms for the security of this species of property it was in our power to make.
So this debate was two guys disagreeing about how best to support the plantation economy. Antebellum history would prove Pinckney right. Yes, Southerners had to make some concessions, but overall, the new federal compact proved to be an enormous boon for American slavery. The slave states gained much more than stability. They also negotiated some very favorable deals for themselves that greatly enlarged their political influence within the new Union, such as the 3/5 Compromise. Over the next 70 years, the Constitution...
For those who don't know, the Three-Fifths Compromise is essentially what they originally wanted was slave states wanted to count slaves as people to their population so that they can increase how many people, how many representatives they received in the House of Representatives, and it would also increase their electoral college votes. Well, the Three-Fifths Compromise means that 3 out of every 5 slaves will be counted towards the population of southern states and other free states at the time as well.
Would aid Southern interests much more than it would ever hinder them.
I don't know about that, but one of the deals made during the Constitutional Convention included a provision which allowed states to leave the Union if they were dissatisfied with statehood. The states that seceded in 1861 attempted to do this and were wrongly warred upon by Lincoln and the federal government.
Well, dude, this is a moot point anyway because of Texas v. White, but I'll indulge you. Where is...
Texas v. White is a Supreme Court case which basically said that it was unconstitutional for a state to secede from the Union. I feel that this can still be debated upon, though, because of how ambiguous the Constitution is about it. They really don't mention succession at all. So I'm of the opinion that a state or coalition of states should be allowed to succeed if they believe the U.S. government's doing a poor job. But that's obviously a controversial opinion, and opinion that many scholars and many constitutional scholars, lawyers, don't share. But I am of that opinion that that was probably the original intent of the Founding Fathers, was to do that. But it's very, very ambiguous, so we really, really can't comment on it too much. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm sure many of you disagree with me, and please let me know why you disagree with me. And I'm sure Atun Shei disagrees with me as well.
Is that provision exactly?
The right to secede is in Article 10.
It's Amendment 10.
Amendment 10. Our great Constitution is built in a way of enumerated powers. That means the government can only do what is listed. All else is a right granted to the states, including secession.
Okay, so the 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." That's certainly a very broad curtailing of federal power, but I don't see anything in there about state secession.
It's implied.
Okay, well, if we're just vague booking our way through constitutional law here, I could just as easily point to Article 6, Section 2, which states, "The authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding." In a number of early decisions...
See, that's what I mean, how vague the Constitution is about this. You could interpret it either ways, and I like that he shows kind of both sides of the coin to this.
The Supreme Court interpreted that clause to mean that when federal and state law clash, federal law is supreme. That would certainly imply that unilateral...
I would say that court case, though, was essentially after the Civil War, and it was meant to ensure that we did not have other states attempt to leave the Union, just because of how Reconstruction worked, and there was always the sort of kind of threat that they could leave again if certain rights weren't upheld within the South for former Confederates.
Session over something like, oh, I don't know, an election not going your way would be super illegal.
Lincoln.
Now, Smith, if you worship government, according to James Madison, the great architect of our Constitution, there is...
Okay, I have some bones to pick about this, but I'll let him continue. I'm sorry for pausing.
There's nothing ambiguous about the powers that are granted to the federal government, as he says in Federalist 45. And might I add that this James Madison fellow, he was a founding father.
The powers delegated by the proposed constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will for the most part be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all of the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state.
True enough, but you forget that Madison also wrote in plain English that once admitted, states do not have the right to withdraw from the Union.
The Constitution requires an adoption in toto and forever.
Yeah, I was about to say there's no way that James Madison would be in favor of succession. That's my big bone to pick up. He's explaining it now, but I truly don't believe that he would be in favor of states just being able to succeed.
It has been so adopted by the other states. An adoption for a limited time would be as defective as an adoption of some of the articles only. This idea of states reserving the right to withdraw was started at Richmond and considered as a conditional ratification, which was itself considered as worse than a rejection.
His whole theory of the compound republic proved to be pretty crucial to Southern political thought. Thanks in part to Eli Whitney, over the coming decades, the cotton industry exploded, and the slave states of the Deep South multiplied and prospered. Plantation agriculture expanded to the Gulf Coast and beyond. Per Federalist 45, slave owners could wield the fearsome apparatus of central government in pursuing external objects, namely expanding the nation's southwestern borders and making those states and territories hospitable to slavery. Concerning internal objects, the sovereignty of the states was supreme. Within their little state fiefdoms, slaveholder elites could rule however they saw fit, which allowed them to unaccountably and brutally police their black underclass. The arrangement worked out very well for them. Their only fear was that one day an anti-slavery federal government would try to meddle with the institution, and more broadly,
This is why you had so many compromises. When you had the Missouri Compromise, you had the Northwest Ordinance, you had all of these compromises to ensure that we would have a free state and a slave state, just to ensure that a federal government could not one up the slave states just because of how delicate the balance was. So you see how basically this, when you had Lincoln be elected, when you started to see new states be admitted to the Union, which would be free states, and you kind of ran out of land that you could realistically put cotton on or other cash crops, where slavery frankly wasn't very viable. When you only had New Mexico and Arizona left, what you kind of see how it all toppled down, and that's very important.
the racial order that American slavery had established.
You forget there was also Southern opposition to an ever more authoritarian federal government that had nothing to do with slavery. When your unlamented progenitor, the fat, toothless, obnoxious, and disliked President John Adams, signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law, it was the great southern states of Kentucky and Virginia who stood against this early form of Yankee tyranny.
That's right. Inspired primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Upper South had a states' rights doctrine that was initially much more libertarian and was only incidentally concerned with the rights of slaveholders.
Exactly. And it was that spirit of 76 that swelled within us, swelling until it erupted out of us into a pure white font of freedom, which gave rise to this, our second war of independence.
Second War of Independence. I caught that earlier, that he called it the First War of Independence, but that's very funny that he's calling it the Second War of Independence. And I guess to the Southerners, that's basically what it was. They thought that they were fighting for their rights. They thought that they were fighting for becoming a new country. But at the top, they were fighting to keep the antebellum South the way it was. They wanted the establishment kept in order, and that is the dark side. I think for many of the common Southern soldiers, they were fighting for other reasons, but when it came to the government that they represented, they were fighting for slavery.
Not quite. In the years following the War of 1812, things changed. First came the controversy which led to the Missouri Compromise. In 1819, congressional disagreements about the expansion of slavery to the soon-to-be state of Missouri exploded into a full-blown sectional crisis as anti-slavery lawmakers launched their first major attack on the institution's thus far unmolested westward expansion.
Oh, well, that was just a cynical attempt by the North to keep the balance of power tipped in their favor. Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state, but you Northerners knew that
I disagree on that as well, but we obviously had the Missouri Compromise. There was some abolitionists in Missouri at the time who would have loved for it to be admitted as a free state. So that's why you had to have the Missouri Compromise, because it was so controversial for Missouri to be entered in as a slave state instead of a free state.
That would give the South more representation in Congress, and we can't have that now, can we?
Actually, there's every indication that James Talmadge, the congressman who initially proposed restricting slavery in Missouri, did so on moral grounds. And in any case, Northern public opinion was united on the issue. Slavery was an affront to nature, and allowing its unchecked expansion to the West would constitute a betrayal of the foundational American values of freedom and equality. Debating the issue on the floor of the House, Representative Arthur Livermore of New Hampshire argued that the very soul of America was at stake.
An opportunity is now presented, if not to diminish, at least to prevent, the growth of a sin which sits heavy on the souls of every one of us. By embracing this opportunity, we may retrieve the national character, and in some degree our own. But if we suffer it to pass unimproved, let us at least be consistent, and declare that our Constitution was made to impose slavery, and not to establish liberty.
What's that I smell wafting down from the north? Is that the odor of hypocrisy?
No, I just farted.
When was slavery abolished up there in the Yankee states? Remind me again.
Well, for the most part in the 1780s, when emancipation ceased to be the province of tree-hugging Quakers and entered the political mainstream.
You know as well as I that most northern states didn't abolish slavery right away. In fact, due to considerable backlash from their own slave owners, they began a process of gradual emancipation, some of which didn't take full effect for decades. Is this not so?
It is.
Furthermore, census data reveals that northern New England was the only region where these slaves were freed relatively quickly. In 1820, as the supposedly anti-slavery Northerners were moralizing about this supposedly Southern evil during the Missouri crisis, there were 48 slaves in Rhode Island, 97 slaves in Connecticut, 10,088
That's a lot. Holy shit. That is a ton of slaves in New York.
Slaves in New York, 7,557 slaves in New Jersey, and 211 slaves in Pennsylvania. So much for your free states.
The hypocrisy of the North was there, but at the same time, you have to realize that it was controversial to end it even in the North just because of the way that people had their views back then. But I do agree with Johnny Reb there that was a little bit, there was some hypocrisy behind that.
Yeah, I got nothing to say to that.
Might as well end the episode there.
Well, hang on just a goddamn minute. I haven't finished my larger point. Despite the hypocrisy of it, which I fully acknowledge, the North was united in opposing the expansion of slavery. So, faced with such strong opposition, Upper South Jeffersonian planters joined forces with Deep South pro-slavery planters to create a solid Southern political bloc to meet it. For the first time in American history, the country was divided, not just along political, but sectional lines, with slavery the cornerstone of conflict.
One must look at more than just the surface issue. What does slavery represent? I say it represents 1. Economic continuity, a refusal to upend and crash the Southern economy. 2. Social continuity, a desire to preserve the social status quo and avoid social upheaval. And 3. Political continuity, clinging to the existing political order of individual and states' rights.
That economic continuity could be better described as naked self-interest, because again, by this time, plantation agriculture had become extremely profitable and made the white upper class of the South insanely rich. That social continuity was a draconian racial hierarchy that was predicated on the violent subjugation and enslavement of millions of people for the sole purpose of raking in those insane profits. And that political continuity of states' rights was becoming ever more intertwined with slavery and the defense of slavery. Jesus. For example,
I wonder if he's like, I'm not complaining. I wish he would talk a little bit more about the Civil War in this video. This seems to be a lot of pre-Civil War and pre the election of Lincoln, and I've always liked how he discusses the Civil War, but There's a lot of video left, so I'm sure he's going to get more into the Civil War. As he said, he's going to do a continuous timeline since the founding of the country.
In 1822, South Carolina passed the Negro Seamen's Act, which declared that all foreign free black sailors visiting the port of Charleston would have to be detained in the local jail for the duration of their visit.
Holy crap. I didn't know that was ever a thing. So you had free people literally put in jail because of their race, even though just because they didn't want them out and about. That is insane. It just shows how frankly racist some of these southern states were back in the 19th century. That's crazy though. I've never heard of that law.
One Jamaican sailor took South Carolina to federal court over this, claiming that the statute violated the 1815 Commercial Convention between the United States and Great Britain. The court ruled in his favor and declared the Seamen's Act unconstitutional. Good. Slave owners were furious. They believed the ruling flew in the face of Madison's concept of external and internal jurisdiction and represented a dangerous and destabilizing attack on the racial hierarchy of the South. Writing in the aftermath of the decision, the governor of Georgia predicted that
soon, very soon, the federal government, discarding the mask, will openly lend itself to a combination of fanatics for the destruction of everything valuable in the southern country. The moment we cease to be masters, we shall be slaves.
And then, during the fallout of the Tariff of 1828, the flirtation of states' rights politics and pro-slavery power became an out-and-out marriage. No one was more instrumental in this than John C. Calhoun. He fiercely opposed the tariff of
the nullification crisis.
Abomination. The Tariff of Abominations, which had a number of deleterious effects on the Southern economy. It was a sectional dispute at the end of a long decade of sectional disputes. Calhoun's constitutional theories, which he was developing during this period, thus took on a distinctly sectional flavor. Rabidly pro-slavery, Calhoun harmonized the Upper South's distrust of centralized...
So for those who don't know, the nullification crisis was under Andrew Jackson's presidency, and John C. Calhoun was actually the vice president to Andrew Jackson, which is so hilarious. He actually wanted to kill John C. Calhoun, and John C. Calhoun would be the first vice president to ever resign in U.S. history. But essentially, there was a bunch of tariffs that negatively affected the South more than it did the North. So John C. Calhoun and other South Carolinians wanted to basically get rid of it and nullify the bill. So they claimed that the tariffs did not apply on South Carolina soil, which was clearly against the Constitution. But they also said that if the tariffs were not getting rid of, basically, or there's not a compromise, that South Carolina would secede from the Union. And this is a common lost cause talking point to say that the war wasn't about slavery and instead about taxes and states' rights because of the nullification crisis in South Carolina threatening to leave the Union over it.
Power with the Deep South's terror of emancipation into a radical reimagining of Madison's compound republic. In his mind, the idea that the United States was a cohesive national polity was constitutional heresy, and he believed that states basically had unlimited powers to protect themselves from federal interference and the tyranny of the majority.
Well, that sounds nice.
The devil comes in a pleasing shape. Calhoun's theory of government came to be almost exclusively concerned with furthering Southern slaveholder interests. And as these ideas gained traction, Virginian lawyers Abel Upshur and Beverly Tucker wrote influential polemics, bringing rights of property and slaves to the very center of Jeffersonian constitutional thought. What emerged from this ideological confluence of the 1820s South was a political platform that came to be broadly known as Southern rights. Many of its principles would go on to be foundational tenets of the Confederate worldview.
Here's my holdup with this narrative of yours, and I mean this sincerely. The Declaration of Independence gives us the right to pursue our own happiness, free from government interference. Yes, slavery was evil, but there's another principle involved here, is there not? Give the government an inch on one issue and they'll take a mile on another one. Next thing you know, you're getting groped by rent-a-cops at the airport.
What?
Therefore, I would argue that states' rights were a crucial component of the checks and balances of power.
Well, obviously, states' rights is an essential part of checks and balances. However, in the federal government has shown this that they sometimes don't value states' rights. For instance, when it comes to the drinking age being 21, the federal government has consistently threatened to withhold federal funding for highways if states were not to obey the drinking laws. So many of you, or I should probably say many of your parents, grew up with the drinking age being 18, but that had to change nationwide. And the same thing was going to happen when they changed the tobacco age from 18 to 21. So you kind of see how the federal government can overstep constantly when it comes to states' rights. But states have the right to basically give their own education. They have the rights to have the DMV. They have many rights, but and that is an essential part of our government. But what I've found a lot of times is that the federal government will do like kind of sleazy tactics to ensure that states obey on certain issues that they want them to.
Rats stamped out under the boot heels of a million Yankee soldiers. And our country is lesser for it.
Well, I would argue that within the philosophy of Southern rights, individual and state rights always took a back seat to economic advantage and political power. What you would describe as a conflict between Northern authoritarianism and Southern libertarianism, I would describe as a struggle between two competing concepts of American nationhood. Slave owners became convinced that the best security for their fortunes and property was to enshrine manifestly pro-slavery legislation into national law.
Obviously, that's a good point as well, because there's always going to be limits to states' rights within the United States model. So the best way to do it is you protect it at the national level. And not only do you protect it, but you expand it. A big part of the southern states succeeding from the Union was they wanted to expand the institution of slavery to places like the Caribbean, Cuba, for instance. Many actually wanted to go in Central America and start invading those territories because that would give them ripe new states and territories that they can make slavery that they can make as slave states, which would even the balance of the states of the Northwest, which were all going to be free states just because of where they stood when it came to what was there. So there's big forests in Oregon. You can't have plantations in Oregon. It rains too much. There's too much forestry. So you have state you have these slave states trying to expand the institution of slavery basically near the equator so that they can get new slave states, which would be ripe for slavery and cash crops.
The Constitution had become extremely accommodating of the slave system, but maddeningly, it lacked an explicit and concrete endorsement of human bondage. Southern rights advocates spent much of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s attempting to correct that mistake.
Aha! But what about the proposed Corwin Amendment in the winter of '61, just before the war? Lincoln offered the South the explicit constitutional protection for slavery that you say they were looking for, and yet we still seceded, proving it was about states' rights after all.
We already talked about the Corwin Amendment.
The Corwin Amendment was an amendment, basically the last-ditch effort to preserve the Union, and what it did was it basically ensured that slavery would remain in the South, and it would basically be enshrined in the Constitution. However, it didn't give us any rights when it came to expanding slavery. So that's why they rejected it. And I think I'm going to stop here today. It's a good stopping point. Remember to like and subscribe for part 2. Thanks, guys.